It was a few days before Christmas when Sarah found herself driving through the town, stressed and annoyed. She'd waited too long to buy gifts, and now every store was packed. The shelves were empty, and she couldn't find anything for her family. She thought she'd been to every store in town until she drove down a road she'd never noticed before. At the end of the street was a large, strange-looking store. It had glowing Christmas lights around the windows, and a sign simply read, "The Christmas Emporium." Could it be? Sarah muttered to herself, already tired of the chaos she had faced all day. Without thinking twice, she turned the car and pulled into the lot. There was something oddly inviting about it, like it was calling her in. As she entered, the door let out a faint creak, and the cold air inside hit her like a brick. The store was oddly silent. The typical jolly Christmas music was replaced with a slow, haunting melody that echoed throughout the store. The shelves were lined with Christmas decoration trees, ornaments, wrapping paper. Everything looked perfect at first, but there was something strange about it all. The colors were too vivid, almost unreal, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the aisles. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she wandered deeper into the store. No one else was there. The aisles seemed to twist in odd directions, making it impossible to see the end of them. The air felt heavy, like something wasn't right. She reached the back of the store and saw an elderly man standing behind a counter, his eyes fixed on her. He had a faded red suit on, just like an old-time Santa, but his face, it was pale, his eyes deep and hollow. "Can I help you, dear?" His voice was warm, yet there was something unsettling about it. It sounded almost like a whisper, like it was too close to her ears. Sarah hesitated but nodded. "I'm just looking for a few last-minute Christmas gifts." The old man smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide and naturally, wide, and his teeth were too sharp. "You've come to the right place," he said. "This is no ordinary store, you know," with the man's words still echoing in her mind. Sarah moved further down the aisles, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on her. As she walked, she noticed things. The dolls on the shelves had lifeless, glassy eyes that stared back at her, unblinking. The Christmas trees were adorned with twisted, dark ornaments, ones that didn't belong in a holiday store. She reached out to touch one of the ornaments, and just as her fingers brushed the surface, she heard a faint sound. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it made her freeze. The whisper seemed to say, "Leave." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She quickly pulled her hand away and turned to leave, but as she walked towards the entrance, she realized something horrifying. The door had disappeared. She turned around in panic. The aisles had changed. The store now felt like a maze, the walls closing in, the shelves towering higher. The Christmas lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. Sarah's pulse raced as she heard soft footsteps behind her. She whipped around, but there was no one. Just the same cold, empty aisles. That's when the whispers returned. Louder this time, almost like they were coming from inside her head. "Sarah, Sarah." She broke into a run, but the store seemed to stretch on endlessly. No matter how fast she ran, she couldn't find the exit. The aisles twisted and turned, leading her deeper into the store, and the whispers grew louder. The temperature dropped, and she felt a cold breath on her neck. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something movement. It was a shadow, tall and thin, standing just at the end of one of the aisles. But when she turned to face it, it was gone. The whispers turned into a low chant, a distorted lullaby that made her skin crawl. And that's when she saw it, the old mirror at the end of one of the aisles. The mirror was covered in dust, but something about it drew her closer. Her heart pounded as she reached out to touch the glass. The second her fingers made contact, she felt a coldness shoot up her arm. The reflection in the mirror was wrong. Her own face stared back at her, but her eyes were black, hollow, like a dead person's eyes. Sarah stumbled back in shock. What the hell? The whispers grew louder, and as she looked around, she realized the store wasn't empty anymore. Figures began to materialize in the shadows, people, or what was left of them, standing still in the corners of the aisles. They had lifeless eyes, frozen smiles, and they were staring at her, waiting. Panic seized her chest as the storekeeper's voice echoed around her, louder than ever. "You're mine now, child." She ran, but the shadows chased her, stretching their arms toward her. Every door she tried was locked, every window sealed tight. The walls felt alive, breathing, closing in. That's when she heard it, again, the soft whisper of her name, this time coming from the mirror. But she was too terrified to look back. She kept running, but her legs grew heavier with each step, like the store was pulling her in, dragging her down. And just as she reached the back of the store again, she heard the soft sound of the door opening behind her. She turned around, hope blooming in her chest, only to find that there was no door. There was no way out. The next morning, the store was gone. The empty lot where it had been stood quiet. Not a single sign that it had ever existed. But on the ground, there was something strange. An old gift, wrapped in plain brown paper. The tag read, "Asterisk, for Sarah." It was the night before Christmas, and all through the town, families were tucking in, waiting for Santa's arrival. But for Lily, it wasn't a night of excitement. It was a night of terror. Lily had recently moved to a small town with her family. They had settled into an old, charming house, excited to spend their first Christmas there. The house was old, cozy, decorated with festive lights, and there was a large, beautiful Christmas tree in the living room. But there was something unsettling about the area. The house stood on the outskirts of town, and people often whispered about the surrounding woods. The locals didn't like to talk about it much, and Lily's parents were often on edge when they passed the woods during the day. Rumors from the town hall said that something dark lingered there. But Lily didn't believe in all the superstitions. It was just an old town, she thought. She was sure there was nothing to fear. That was, until Christmas Eve. Lily tried to ignore the unsettling feelings as she climbed into bed that night. She was looking forward to Christmas morning, excited for what Santa might bring. Her parents had warned her to go to bed early, so she settled in with her stuffed animals and dozed off. Around midnight, she woke up to a strange sound, footsteps, slow and heavy, outside her bedroom window. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up, listening carefully. The sound was faint at first, almost like the crunch of boots on snow. But then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife or wind. These were deliberate, slow steps. Lily's curiosity got the best of her, and she cautiously pulled back the curtain to peek outside. The moonlight bathed the snow-covered ground in a pale, eerie glow. There was no one there. The yard was empty, the night still and quiet. But then the footsteps came again. Thump, thump, thump. Lily's pulse quickened as the sound grew louder. They were right outside her window. Her mind raced, and she thought about calling her parents, but she didn't want to alarm them. She told herself it was probably just a person walking through the snow, maybe a neighbor or a late-night wanderer. Still, there was something about the sound that unsettled her. Suddenly, the steps stopped. The silence was deafening. Lily sat up, holding her breath. She waited, tense, hoping it was over. But then she heard the door to her room creak open. Lily's eyes widened in horror as she froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure dressed in a red suit or Santa suit. But it wasn't Santa. It was a man wearing a grotesque, lifeless Santa mask. His eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. His smile was twisted, wide, and unnatural. The mask seemed to be permanently stuck to his face, like a horrific grin frozen in time. Lily's blood ran cold. She couldn't move. Her body was paralyzed with fear. The man in the Santa mask stepped forward, his boots creaking with every step. His voice was a low rasp as he whispered, "You've been a good girl, haven't you, Lily?" Lily couldn't respond. She couldn't even breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her blanket, not daring to look away from the figure. The man took another step forward, and Lily's fear reached its peak. She could feel his eyes on her, even though his face was covered. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Just as the man took another step, the hallway light flickered. The man hesitated, his head snapping toward the door as if he had heard something. The air seemed to grow colder, and Lily's breath formed a cloud in front of her face. And then, without warning, the man turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Lily sat there, trembling, too terrified to move. She could hear nothing but her own breathing, each breath shaky and uneven. She didn't dare move from her bed. Hours passed, and Lily stayed awake, terrified of falling asleep. She could hear distant footsteps in the snow outside, but she refused to look. She didn't want to see that figure again. Eventually, the sound stopped, and Lily thought she might finally be safe. But as the first light of Christmas morning broke through her window, she gathered the courage to look outside. The yard was still, the snow untouched, except for a fresh set of footprints leading directly to her window. The Santa figure had been watching her, and every Christmas after that, Lily would hear the footsteps, again loud and heavy, moving across the snow. She locked her windows and doors, praying she would never see that twisted Santa again. But no matter where she lived, the footsteps always found her. It was Christmas Eve, and the Johnson family was celebrating their first Christmas in the farmhouse at the edge of town. The house had been everything they hoped for, charming, with a wide porch and a large yard. The family had spent the whole day decorating, wrapping presents, and preparing for a cozy Christmas dinner. Everything seemed perfect. But when night fell, things took a strange turn. As the family settled in for the evening, a knock echoed at the door. It was unexpected, considering the snowstorm that had picked up outside. Mr. Johnson opened the door to find a group of carolers standing in the dark, their faces shadowed by the dim street light. They were dressed in old-fashioned ragged clothes, their eyes hollow and wide. The group was made up of 5 people, 4 adults and 1 child. They stood on the doorstep, smiling at the Johnsons with unsettling grins. The cold wind blew through the doorway, sending a chill down Mr. Johnson's spine. "Merry Christmas," the lead caroler said, her voice unnaturally sweet. "We've come to spread Christmas cheer." Before Mr. Johnson could respond, they began singing Good King Wenceslas. But the song didn't sound right. Their voices were off-key, sharp, and discordant. It sent a shiver through him, and he instinctively stepped back, looking at the family behind him. "I'm sorry, but we're not interested in carolers tonight," Mr. Johnson said, trying to sound polite, though his voice trembled. The carolers didn't budge. The lead woman smiled wider. "We insist," she said, and the group began singing louder, their voices echoing through the snow-filled yard. The melody twisted, growing louder, sharper. The Johnsons were on edge, but they tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just a group of people trying to spread some holiday cheer," Mrs. Johnson said, trying to calm her children. But the carolers didn't leave. They stayed on the doorstep, still singing that same eerie song. And then, as if in unison, they stopped. The woman turned and, with a strange, unnatural motion, looked directly at Mr. Johnson. "The season is here, and it's time to give. You will give," she said, in a voice that no longer seemed human. Suddenly, the door slammed shut on its own, and the family was thrown into darkness. The carolers didn't leave. Instead, they began circling the house, their haunting song now a full, dissonant chant. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural, cold light as they continued, relentlessly, to sing. Every window in the house rattled, and the doors slammed. The temperature in the house plummeted as a dark, suffocating presence filled the air. The family rushed to find the nearest exit, but the doors wouldn't open. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. By morning, the house was silent. The carolers were gone. There were no signs of them outside, and the snow had covered their tracks. But when the Johnsons finally dared to step outside, they saw something chilling. The porch had a new decoration, a single wreath, freshly placed on the door, and beneath it, a card with the words, "Asterisk, the season of giving is eternal. The carolers return." The Johnson family left the house soon after, and no one ever spoke of what happened that Christmas Eve. But every year, on Christmas Eve, the song would return, the same eerie asterisk, "Good King Wenceslas," asterisk floating through the wind, coming from nowhere.